My name is Herb. I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date is February 21st, 1984. We're going to talk about step one. Now, I've modified it here on the screen to emphasize a couple things. Susie introduced me as doing a series now of workshops on the second and fourth Mondays of each month for the balance of the year. So much for my resolution of cutting back and reducing my schedule. But you know, when you're invited to do something that's pretty exciting and new and can make the message more visible, especially throughout the world, that's what I do. So I appreciate the invitation, and I'm looking forward to our journey together. My commitment is to give you the essence of each of the steps, both my understanding from the big book. I'm a big book fundamentalist and literalist in the best of senses. I try to understand literally what Bill said, what he meant, how he perhaps applied it himself, and then what my own personal experience is in applying that information. But notice in step one, as I've listed it here in the PowerPoint, I have two words that are all in bold. They're not that way in the big book, but they're going to emphasize the two aspects that I'm going to unpack for us today on the first half of the first step, the part before the dash. Yeah, there's a dash there. It's not an and. The big book reads, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol. Dash. It's not an and. The connotation of that, and Bill was rigorous with regard to the use of English language, is that it's a new subject, it's a new topic, it's connected, but it's not connected. That our lives had become unmanageable, and unmanageable is in all bold. Alcohol, and more broadly, addiction, will be the subject today. The first half of the first step. Next time we get together in 2 weeks, I'll be talking in depth about unmanageability, which I consider to be the best kept secret in the 12-step rooms. You'll see why. And it's my opinion, it's my experience, that really most people in the rooms, at least that I've attended, I have limited exposure geographically and in terms of 12-step fellowships. I'm in AA, and that's my limit to my experience, and I'm in the Southern California area, and that's the limit of my experience. But obviously, because of Zoom, we've got a much broader reach, both internationally and broadly through all of the 12-step fellowships, because that's my ministry. And I use that word. That's my ministry. All 12-step fellowships. Bill, in the preface to the first edition of the big book, take a look. First paragraph, last line, in the first paragraph of the last line of the preface to the very first edition, our way of living may have its advantages for all. Now, we're talking to you about addiction for right now. Next time we get together, we'll be talking about unmanageability. I'm not talking to you today about alcohol specifically and only. Although that's my experience, I can broaden it now to all forms of addiction, because the dynamic from the big book is the same, even though it doesn't include all addictions in its vocabulary. The dynamic is absolutely the same, whether it's a substance addiction or a process addiction. More about that in a minute. And then we'll unpack next time unmanageability, the spiritual malady, the cancer of the soul. Those are terms that Bill uses, the Oxford group uses. Bill came from the Oxford group. There's a history here. It's really important to understand. The very first alcoholic that we have records of that attempted to find a spiritual experience did so because Carl Jung, that famed psychiatrist, was treating him. His name was Roland Hazard. He went to Switzerland in probably 1931, 1932, right in that area. He was the chairperson of Allied Chemical Corporation. His family had started it. They were multi-millionaires, and at that time, that meant a lot of money. It still does. But in 1932, 1933, they had survived the Depression and the crash, and they were affluent. But Roland Hazard, the chairman of Allied Chemical, was a drunk. Now, his parents lovingly sent him to Switzerland to see Carl Jung and to stay there for a year. Oh my God. And Carl Jung said, this is a very special man. He's very bright. He's very motivated. He's got enough money to pay my bills. I don't know that for a fact, but it's good to have a sense of humor. And he said, you know what? You're really hopeless. You need to stay locked up or with a bodyguard for the rest of your life because you have this problem with alcohol. And psychiatrists have never had success with an alcoholic. You need to find a spiritual experience. Well, how humble of him, the second most famous psychiatrist in the world. And Roland said, well, great, I'll go back to church. And Jung may have said something like, young man, you're not listening to me. I didn't say go to church and find religion. I said find a spiritual experience. Well, fortunately, Roland Hazard went back to New York, and in his parents' cathedral, Episcopal Cathedral, he found the Oxford group meeting. It may have been a bulletin board notice. In the basement, the Oxford group is meeting to bring you to true Christianity. That was their purpose. The Oxford group had nothing to do with alcoholics. They didn't even like alcoholics. They were started by a Lutheran minister, Frank Buckman, back in the 20s. At the time Bill got involved, it was being shepherded by an Episcopal priest. Notice, Lutheran minister started it, Episcopal priest is running it. They have 6 steps. At least it looks like that. You could go to page 263 in the 4th edition. In the story there, the man is relating the process that he went through to get sober and in early AA, and he talks about these 6 steps. They got them from the Oxford group. Bill was in the Oxford group. Ebby Thatcher was in the Oxford group. Roland Hazard joined the Oxford group, reached out to Ebby Thatcher, who reached out to Bill Wilson, who reached out to Bob Smith. Bob Smith was already in the Oxford group for 2.5 years. Bob Smith went to a weekly meeting with Anne. She dragged him, of course. And they prayed and they talked. And after each meeting for 2.5 years, Bob Smith, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, went home and got drunk. Because he thought the problem was a moral problem. He thought the problem was a weak willpower problem. He thought the problem was a knowledge problem. Until Bill Wilson met him and explained the real problem is addiction. Bill got that information from Dr. Silkworth, the psychiatrist. Silkworth was not an alcoholic. He was a really, really gentle, humble, and spiritual man who was in charge of the town's hospital psychiatric and drug addiction, alcohol recovery ward in New York. And he had seen thousands of people come in and out. He had seen Bill come in 1933, and then 3 times in 1934, September, November, and December. And in December, he tells, maybe November, he tells Lois that Bill is going to die or go insane because his experience is it's a fatal disease. These are the 3 major confluences of influence. The direction that a spiritual experience is necessary, the direction that a process is necessary, the direction that, in fact, you're hopeless and helpless on your own power. It's an amazing. These gentlemen didn't actually know one another. The problem is addiction. I mentioned that earlier. Substance and/or process. Certainly my substance is alcohol. My story's for a different day. My wife went into the hospital in February of 1984 for her alcohol problem. We didn't know anything about it. We knew that she drank too much and it created problems in the house. And she decided to take care of it. I went there to support her, and they asked me to ask myself a question and also to stop drinking for 90 days. February 20th, 1984, they asked me to stop drinking for 90 days. I had had a drink that day, just a drink or two with my boss. And then I came and went to the hospital program to support my wife's recovery, but they could smell it. And they said, by the way, quit drinking for 90 days to support your wife's recovery. I agreed. I was willing. February 21st is my anniversary. I did not go to AA. I did not pray. I did not think I had a problem. I did not acknowledge I had a problem. I did nothing. Alcohol was removed. I have not had a drink nor an inclination to have a drink since February 21st of 1984. I didn't go to AA for another 2 months. But what I did was respond willingly to the direction from the hospital program, number 1, to quit drinking, and number 2, to write out my history with alcohol. If you don't know whether or not you have a problem with whatever the substance and/or process is, substance, alcohol, drugs, and food, process, all the other things you see on the screen, codependence, meaning relationship, gambling, debting, pornography, internet, exercise, work, anger, fear, dishonesty, religion, 12-step meetings. I mean it. Lots of people hide out in 12-step meetings. They don't know they're doing that because they think that's the solution. Meetings are not the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. Meetings are not the program of a 12-step program. Meetings are wonderful. Meetings are important. They're creating a new discipline and new habits and new outlooks on life and new connections and social relationships. Life changes when we go to meetings. I'm very supportive of meetings. I have a home group and I go to Alcoholics and meetings, and I'm 37 years sober. And I have a vital personal spiritual life, but meetings are not the program. I went to meetings for 4 years. Every day. My sponsor said, go to a meeting every day. I did. Call me every day. I did. Get a big book and read it and work the steps. I did. The problem is he never told me how to work the steps. I didn't know that he didn't know, and I didn't know it was a problem. I did what I was told. I could not unpack the big book on my own. For 4 years, I was sober. And for 4 years, I was not awake. For 4 years, I was asleep, dreaming that I was awake. Today, I'm going to talk about what constitutes an addiction. Alcohol, you could substitute the word addiction at the top. I'm going to stay with alcohol because that's step one, formally and fundamentally in the big book. Unmanageable, I will talk about in 2 weeks. I'll give you some hints as to maybe how to prepare for that. It will be very simple, but perhaps, hopefully, very revealing, because alcohol and addiction is a problem. It's just not the problem. Unmanageability is the problem. Alcohol and or addiction is a symptom of the problem. And we have a body problem. We have an allergy and an obsession. Well, that was the first assignment that I received at 4 years of sobriety. I had admitted I was an alcoholic after I went to AA after 2 or 3 months of not drinking. They suggested I try an AA meeting, which I did. And after going to an AA meeting several times, I did identify with their stories and said, okay, I'm an alcoholic. Look at the drama. For 4 years, I was an alcoholic because of the drama. Drunk driving arrests, blackouts, hospitalizations, trouble at work, trouble at home, trouble every place. Trouble was my definition of alcoholism, trouble with alcohol. Well, it was good enough for me. It may be good enough for you for right now, but it won't keep you around, because once the trouble stops for a long period of time, we got this. I can relax now. The problem is I didn't know what made me an alcoholic. And when I heard a man share and I engaged him to be my step guide. Yeah, it's a term I use, step guide. He wasn't my sponsor. He was a project manager. I heard him share. I resonated with what he said. I asked him for help, and I didn't realize that he was a big book mechanic. He himself had been led through the steps out of the big book, a textbook, which he described as a precise book of instructions with precise actions to take and knowledge to get and experiences to have, so that you could eventually have the promised spiritual awakening in step 12. He took me into the doctor's opinion. Now, the doctor's opinion is brilliant. It's a letter written by Dr. Silkworth, the psychiatrist that treated Bill, who was not an alcoholic, but he's a medical doctor. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor with a specialty training in psychiatry. So they both treat the body as a medical doctor, and they treat the mind and emotions as a psychiatrist. So glibly and wonderfully, analytically, in the doctor's opinion, Dr. Silkworth describes the problem of the body. He alludes to the problem of the mind, but he never really addresses it. He talks about the problem of the body and the mind, the body having an allergy, the mind having an obsession, but that unpacking of the word obsession and the problem of the mind, I'll talk about in a little bit, was left to Bill Wilson. Pages 23 to 43 in the big book. The doctor's opinion and the material in the first chapter, Bill's story, are really important to show the progressive nature of the disease of addiction. Progressive meaning it deteriorates and gets worse, and we don't know it's getting worse, and the not knowing getting worse is the problem of the mind. The deterioration of the body is the problem of the allergy. It's a biological problem. This is now not speculation. Science has concluded alcohol and alcoholics is a problem of a dysfunctional liver. My liver does not successfully process alcohol. 9 out of 10 people will process alcohol and they will eliminate it in their urine or through their sweat glands. 1 out of 10 persons are alcoholic where the liver does not successfully process the alcohol and it creates a chemical that is placed in the cellular structure, and the cellular structure then demands more alcohol. Dr. Silkworth calls that a craving. Please hear this. Craving in a dictionary is the desire for something. Before you ever have it, I woke up this morning desiring a cup of coffee, craving a cup of coffee. That's not what the big book means. That's not what Dr. Silkworth means. He says very clearly there, and you can read it in the book. I'm not going to be quoting the book. Well, directly. He says the craving never begins until we take the first drink. The craving never begins for other addictions until we take the first bite, until we take the first bet, until we press the button for the first piece of pornography, until we take out the credit card for the first debting. Whatever it is, my daughter is in Al-Anon, and she says, Dad, your problem is drinking. My problem is thinking. Once I walked into a room in college, was filled with young people having fun. I would do a radar sweep of the room, and when I connected to a young man and the vroom vroom went off in me, the relationship was on, and they always turned out to be alcoholic. I could pick them 1 out of 100. I could just pick them out. That was my radar sweep. The alcoholic is addicted to alcohol. The Al-Anon is addicted to the alcoholic. The allergy. Once I begin, I cannot stop. This is Dr. Silkworth, who said the only, and it's not on the screen, somehow my PowerPoint dropped it to the bottom. The only solution is abstinence. So Bill Wilson very clearly says, well, if that's the problem, page 23, if that's the problem, stop. If you have a problem with alcohol, please stop it. If you have a problem with codependent relationships, for God's sake, get a grip. Stop it. Well, nice try. Because we can't. Read pages 23 to 43 and read it carefully, because Bill talks about the obsession and the delusion. He talks about the problem of the mind. The problem of the body is biology. We have an allergy. I'm allergic to cats, so I don't go around cats. I'm allergic to thin-skinned fresh fruit, so I don't eat thin-skinned fresh fruit. I never went to Cats Anonymous. I never went to Fresh Fruits Anonymous, because I could make a decision to stop and to stay stopped because of the pain. How come I would go to jail? How come I would go to hospitals? How come I would have blackouts? How come I would have all these problems over a 20-year drinking period? And I didn't connect the dots. Bill uses the word insane. It's in the second step. It's such a critical word, insanity. Most people in the rooms are ignorant. I'm sorry. I don't mean to be diminutive or denigrating, big words. I don't mean to dismiss people and judge them. But I do mean to observe not knowing. Insane in the big book does not mean psychiatric or psychological. It comes literally, Bill was a wordsmith. It comes literally from the origin of the word, from Latin, sanus, S-A-N-U-S, it means health. And when you put an I-N in front of it, it means not healthy. That's all it means in the big book. If you want to look it up on page 37 at the end of Jim's story, the guy who put a little whiskey in his milk, Bill tells us what his definition of insanity is. Whatever the precise definition of the word may be, we call this plain insanity. I'm reading. How can a lack of proportion? That's what Bill means by insane, a lack of proportion. Not psychiatric and psychological, not crazy in that sense. A lack of the ability to think straight, a mental problem. My mind does not process reality correctly. In the same way, my body does not successfully process alcohol. My mind does not successfully process reality, certainly about alcohol. How come in 1968 I had a drunk driving arrest and I got another one in 1971, and it never occurred to me that they were connected to alcohol and or a problem? I had other justification stories for a different day. It's not important. But I never connected the dots. I never saw the full picture. I didn't put the puzzle pieces together. Well, Bill talks about an obsession. It's really important to know what these words mean. That's a thought. An obsession is a thought. Not all thoughts are an obsession. When a sponsor says, if you have the thought of a drink, pray. If you have the thought of a drink, call me. If you have the thought of a drink, go to a meeting. If you have the thought of a drink, help someone. Great, absolutely. 10th step. I mean, we're not talking about the 10th step, but that's what we're talking about. Absolutely, will absolutely change your thoughts. But obsession is a special kind of thought. It's a thought that hijacks us. It's a thought that takes possession of us without our permission and without our consciousness. Without our permission and without our consciousness. That's why it's under the, look at the top of the screen, powerless. Oh, we become so brain dead to that word. Challenge yourself. What does powerless mean? Oh, on the surface of it, it means no power. No, please, no, none, zippo, zero, nada. No power. Or used a different vocabulary. How about no choice? When I put alcohol in my body, it's 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm in the bar with my friends after work. I've called my wife and I said, I'll be home at 7 o'clock to have family dinner. Family dinner was really important to us. And more often than not, I was home at 7 o'clock. Sometimes I didn't make it. I intended to have 2 drinks, and sometimes I had 22. And I never knew the cycle because I'm a periodic alcoholic, and the cycle did not reveal itself to me. It wasn't daily. On February 20th, 1984, I had a drink with my boss, and then I picked up the kids and I went to the hospital to support my wife's recovery. I didn't have the inclination for another drink. I could quit drinking for a day, a week, a weekend, 2 weeks, 90 days when I had the self-help program to do. I had no problem with quitting. I had a problem with staying quit. The problem of the body is that once I start, I cannot stop. But there's a difference between a chronic alcoholic, like my wife, the last 10 years, every time she drank till she passed out, and she drank every day. She couldn't help herself. We didn't know that at the time. But it doesn't happen all the time to me. So I call that a periodic alcoholic. Every bit an alcoholic. Sometimes that really helps people understand their own obliviousness, if that's a word, to the connection. It didn't happen every time. It happened infrequently. In psychology, they call that intermediate reinforcement. It's the least observable, but the most powerful. But Bill says on page 23, the problem is not stopping, the problem is staying stopped. We have a delusion. This is the nature of insanity in the big book. The obsession is a thought, a very special kind of thought that hijacks us. But the content of the thought is a delusion, meaning a lie. I'll translate that into everything that we can relate to. It'll be different this time. Some of us are so deluded, we think it will be better this time. It's always different, meaning worse. It's never better, but we fail to know that we don't know, to see that we don't see, to connect the dots. It's an amazing, startling, embarrassing experience. Fortunately, there's a process of transformation. That's the last word that you can't see on the screen, that the 6 steps of the Oxford group gave us. Unmanageability, which is what we'll talk about in 2 weeks, is a problem of the will. My body is a problem. It's a biological problem. Once I take a drink or once I engage in an activity that's my addiction, I've pulled the trigger. The bullet has been fired. So why not just stop? Once I stop, I cannot stay stopped. Because I have a spiritual malady. Bill uses those terms. Unmanageability as the spiritual malady. My body has an allergy. That's a biological problem. My mind has a unique vulnerability to an obsession. I'll use that word. Vulnerability to an obsession. Normal people learn from their mistakes. We're not normal. We don't learn from our mistakes. Page 30 really captures that. It's strongly, if you haven't seen it before, please pay attention to it. We learned that we had to fully concede to our innermost self that we were alcoholics. This is the first step in recovery. The delusion that we are like other people or presently maybe has to be smashed. Please look at that carefully. The delusion, the lie, that we are like other people, we're not, or presently maybe, or ever will be, has to be smashed. The difference between a cucumber and a pickle is that the cucumber was put in brine. And once you take the pickle out of the brine, it never becomes a cucumber again. Once a pickle, always a pickle. Once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. Once an addict, always an addict. The spiritual malady is what Carl Jung gave us the solution to. A spiritual experience. So the problem is no choice. That's what powerless means. 1 out of 10 people are alcoholic. 5 out of 10 people are impacted by the alcoholic and or have other addictions. But the real problem, and we'll talk about it in 2 weeks, is unmanageability. 100% of the human race, not just of addicts, not just of alcoholics. The problem, the human problem, the problem pandemic is unmanageability, that spiritual malady. The problem of the body is an allergy. Once I take a drink, I will take another drink. It's not because I want it. It's not because I feel it. It's not because I think it. It's biochemical. Please hear that. It's biochemical. If I put a vial of black ink into a gallon of clean, clear water, the water will turn black irretrievably. When I put alcohol into my system, my liver processes it in a way that my cellular structure receives a chemical that then demands, the cellular structure demands more chemical. It's a biological mandate, a biological imperative. That's the phenomenon of craving that happens after I take a drink, after I take a bite, after I take an action or engage in whatever my addiction is. In terms of the mind, I have this mental obsession. Jim's story, the car salesman, he says he failed to enlarge his spiritual life. Well, what does that mean? He was experiencing the promises. Read pages, I believe it's 35 to 37. He was such a bad alcoholic that every time he drank, he went to the nut farm, to the insane asylum, to the mental ward. He began to work, perhaps the steps with Bill and Bob, and he had the promises. His wife was returned, his family was returned. He got a job with a company that he lost, but he got a job back and everything is going well. He failed to enlarge his spiritual life. What does that mean? Well, I didn't know that until I became more familiar with the big book. And on page 14, Bill uses the same phrase in a different context at the bottom. When we fail to enlarge our spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others. Oh, what Jim was doing was he got awakened. He got free of his alcohol. He got his job back. He got his family back. And he was so busy with his life that he forgot to carry the message to somebody else, which is the 6th step of the Oxford group. He failed to enlarge his spiritual life, and therefore the spiritual malady, the unmanageability, returned, and his spiritual shield was vulnerable to the obsession, and the obsession returned. I think I'll put a little whiskey in my milk while I'm having a sandwich because I've already had one. I'm safe now. Disgusting thought, whiskey and milk. But be that as it may, this is his story. And he actually believed it. That's what he called insanity, you see. That corruption of our mind. Not being able to see the truth, not being able to know that we know, not being able to see that we don't see. And Fred's story right after that. Fred's a really bright guy. He has only one experience. He's in the hospital. He hears some information. He really understood the information. Listen to him. I really got what you guys said about the strange mental blank spot. All right, that was his experience, a strange mental blank spot. He said, I rather understood what you guys talked about. in terms of your problem with alcohol. I need to find it. A hopeless condition. He says, I really understood the subtle insanity which precedes the first drink. That's very sophisticated information. This guy is brand new in the hospital for the very first time, has never had a problem before, is sitting down perhaps with Bill and Bob, and they're explaining to him about the mental obsession and the delusion. And I got it. Wow. I will stay on guard and exercise my willpower. And he meant it. And yet, without any thought at all, he thought a drink would be a good idea on a wonderful evening in Washington. And he was back in the hospital again. The subtle insanity, which precedes the first drink. I won't see the train coming, but I'll be sitting by the side of the railroad tracks, looking at the vanishing train and the light on the caboose, and I look down and my legs are missing. Dramatic. Exactly. The most embarrassing thing when I did my autobiography in that hospital program of my relationship to alcohol wasn't that I was an alcoholic. The most embarrassing thing was I had never seen it. I mean, I've been a seeker all my life, a self-reflective, introspective, challenging, willing to participate in self-help and therapy and religion and whatever else was coming by. And I had never seen the connection. And I didn't know that I didn't know. I suffered that strange mental blank spot. Bill says on page 43, summing it all up, page 43, the alcoholic, we can use the word the addict, has no effective mental defense against the first drink. You see, that's why I talk about a spiritual shield that makes us invulnerable to the obsession. A spiritual shield that is created by a spiritual experience. We call it grace. We use these words, fancy words, perhaps spiritual, perhaps theological. We don't understand them. Don't take me, I don't understand. But I'll use them because they're the words that we can use to indicate that we can, in fact, find a recovery through a diligent effort of ego deflation, the purpose of steps 4 through 9. Bill suggests at the end of step 9 on pages 84 and 85, we enter the world of the spirit. We are placed in a position of neutrality. That's the promise. We are placed in a position of neutrality. On the title page, he calls that recovered. Check it out. There's 2 title pages. The one has just one title, Alcoholics Anonymous. But the second title page has more information on it. It says how thousands of men and women have recovered. Past tense, not in recovery, not recovering. What does that mean? I believe it correlates with pages 84 and 85. Placed in a position of neutrality. A couple of weeks ago, I was listening to a tape from Bill Wilson talking about his story. I'd never heard him say this before, but I've now repeated it several times because it's so powerful. He said, I was delivered. That day in the hospital, page 13, he works the steps with Evie, second day of the hospitalization. Third day, page 14, he has his mountaintop experience. I was delivered. What a great phrase. I was delivered. I was placed in a position of, hear the grace of that. I was placed. I didn't get there because I worked the steps. I got there because there's some sort of precondition, mysterious precondition about willingness and action that is manifest and witnessed to by finishing the 9th step. It may happen earlier. Read the 3rd step promises on page 63. Read the 5th step promises on page 75. These are indicative of progress and getting some traction, but they're not as clear as the promises on page 84, 85. We are, and that's beyond the 9th step promises, the 10th step promises. We are placed in a position of neutrality. We are placed, we are delivered. Now, I was delivered without any effort or prayer on my part. I don't explain that. For the first 4 years in Alcoholics Anonymous, I did all of what I talked about doing, and I stayed neutral with regard to alcohol, but I didn't change. And I'm going to talk about it next time. I didn't change. I didn't know that change was necessary. I didn't know that change was possible, and I certainly didn't know the process of change. I had no clue about unmanageability. I didn't actually receive the information and the experience of unmanageability until I was 10 years sober. I came into AA in 84 and I was sober. I woke up in 1988 doing the steps, the first time seeing and experiencing the doctor's opinion, having an allergy. It was wonderful because for the very first time I understood why I was an alcoholic. But it was the next time I did the steps in 1991 that the man took special time to help me unpack the mental obsession, the delusion, the no choice part, the critical piece of no choice. There's nothing that I can do to prevent the guillotine from falling. There's nothing I can do. I can't work steps. I can't pray. I can't go to meetings and I can't help others and be effective in preventing the guillotine from falling. I can only hope that all of those actions are the preconditions for the moment of grace and the spiritual shield and the invulnerability. And I live in that hope and that trust. And we'll talk about the daily reprieve, not cured. Read page 52, that 2nd paragraph. That's the behavioral description of unmanageability. Make it personal by using the present tense and the personal pronoun. And then go to pages 60 to 62 and do the same thing, personal pronoun and present tense. Today, you may be 5 years sober, you may be 20 years sober, but read unmanageability as described on page 52 behaviorally and on pages 60 to 62 in terms of a description of the exact nature, and that very first paragraph nails it. Selfishness, self-centeredness, and concludes the same way that page 43 concludes. Page 43, with regard to addiction, we have no effective mental defense against the first rank. Read the last line on the 2nd paragraph on page 62. We can't even reduce it much by wishing or trying on our own power. Unmanageability. That's the real problem. More will be revealed. I'm going to end there.